which originally meant soul. According to Greek mythology, Psyche was a beautiful daughter of a king. Cupid, a god, fell in love with her. She was not permitted to look upon Cupid with mortal eyes. Eventually, she was tempted to peer at him as he slept. He awoke, rebuked her, and left her in distress. She searched in vain for him. Cupid finally repented, and their marriage was finally consummated before the gods. Psyche then attained immortality. Later, the word Psyche also meant butterfly. This was said because both the butterfly and Psyche were freed from the body in which they had been confined on earth. They rise on wings and waft themselves in light. Forms of psychic phenomena reach far back into antiquity. Tradition tells us that Egyptian priests induced what was called temple sleep. This was apparently a form of hypnosis during which suggestions were made to the subject. Also, as a form of psychic therapy, the neophyte's subconscious mind was probed with questions to ascertain his innermost thoughts. The famous Pythian oracles at Delphi were young maidens. For their oracular predictions, they were required to be seated upon a golden tripod in the temple of Apollo, as here shown. In the stone floor of the temple was an aperture out of which came forth an intoxicating gas. This gas was inhaled by the oracle. She then mumbled partially incoherent replies while under the effect of the gas to questions put to her by the Delphinian priests. The priests then interpreted such as best suited their purpose. It was stated that the god Apollo was speaking through each oracle. This was a kind of hallucinogenic form of psychic phenomena. In ancient Peru, the Inca priests and those of the Mayan Empire intoxicated themselves with potions intended to make them communicate with gods and transcendental powers. This brought about a disassociation of their objective and subconscious minds. The subject then felt liberated into a world of greater reality, but actually he was under the influence of a drug. Some of the drugs were said to make the eyes enchanted. This perhaps alluded to the fantastic visions which were experienced by such an induced state of consciousness. In India, Hindu yogis endeavor to enter a state of profound meditation, a deeper level of consciousness. To free themselves of the impressions of the objective senses, they induced a state of self-hypnosis, a psychic sleep. Here we illustrate the method. It is accomplished by intense concentration upon the tip of the nose or upon the navel. Visual fatigue soon follows, and then a loss of normal consciousness. Extrasensory perception means the ability of man to perceive by senses other than those of the visual, auditory, tactile, olfactory, or gustatory organs. There are three kinds of sources of extrasensory perception. There is the transmission and reception of thoughts from one mind to another without any physical agent. This is generally commonly known as telepathy. There is an awareness of distant or hidden things. This is called clairvoyance. Then there is the cognizance or knowledge of an event which has not yet happened. This is known as premonition. Monition is also a form of extrasensory perception. Telekinesis, although not directly related to extrasensory perception, is a psychic phenomenon in which man exercises control over material substances without applying any physical means. In clairvoyance, as here illustrated, a subject may have a percept, that is, receive knowledge about quite impersonal things or events unknown to anyone. While asleep or in meditation, he may suddenly become aware of something happening, perhaps in a far land. He may never have visited the land, or ever known the people involved in what he psychically perceives. It is as though events may suddenly be revealed to him, visually or audibly, as a communication, a point of knowledge. Here we have a symbolic illustration of the psychic phenomenon of premonition, which, as said, is also a form of extrasensory perception. In premonition, the subject has a consciousness of an event before it actually occurs. For example, of a fire or an accident. The time factor of precognition or premonition is usually of current, everyday experiences, rather than of an epochal event or of remote future periods. In this phenomenon, we often experience the past and the future compressed into the present. The event has not yet occurred. That is in the future. When it does occur, it is in the past insofar as the subject's realization of it is concerned, and the whole experience is of the present to the subject. We have depicted here an example of telepathy. It is the response to another person's mental processes without resort to the sensory channels, that is, without the need of the ears or eyes for communication. Telepathy is definitely distinguished from other forms of extrasensory perception, such as clairvoyance or premonition. In clairvoyance, the psychic impressions that are received are not of any one kind. Telepathy, on the other hand, is the reception of the thoughts and mental impressions of others, as well as the transmitting of same. Do powers radiate from the human organism which can control matter at a distance? The illustration here depicts such an effect upon an object by man. The psychic phenomenon, known as telekinesis, concerns the power of mind over material objects without resort to any physical means. Can physical objects be moved? Their position in space changed by, for example, the mere power of thought? There is extensive experimentation in the field of telekinesis by experimenters in psychical research and parapsychology. Experiments in this realm have also been conducted at Rosicrucian University at Rosicrucian Park, San Jose, California. Insofar as is known, telepathic communication, the transmission and reception of thoughts from one mind to another, is not affected by space. regardless of the distance between the participants, there is no apparent measurable lapse of time in the reception of thought. If this fact continued to remain unrefuted, then thought energy will seem to have an even greater velocity than that of the energy of light. With man on distant planets in this space age, experiments with telepathy between them and those on Earth will either refute or substantiate this theory of the timeless velocity of thought. Here we have illustrated a rather common experiment in telepathy. A barrier is set up in the middle of a table. A, the person who will transmit the thought, is seated on one side of the barrier with 5 wooden boxes before him. B, who will try to receive the thought, sits on the other side. He cannot see the boxes. A touches one of the boxes with an arrow. B must, within a limited time, determine which box was touched. 5 successes out of 25 tries is considered evidence of extrasensory perception. Another experiment in extrasensory perception, telepathy, is illustrated here. Subject B leaves the room, closing the door behind him. Others remain in the room, represented by the letter A. They then agree on some incident of a simple nature which they will endeavor to transmit mentally to B. After a short time, B is brought back into the room to relate to others what impression he received. This illustrates an experiment in precognition. Precognition is the psychic phenomenon of having knowledge of an event before its actual occurrence. A, shown here, is to look at a playing card which is not visible to B, the subject. Then A is to transmit a mental picture of the card to B. However, in precognition, B, the subject, receives an impression of the card before A has even made his selection. Could it be that the subject's thought about the card is an impression received by the subconscious mind of A, and it thereby influenced him in the selection of that particular card? Dr. J.B. Rhine, one of the earlier experimenters in parapsychology, devised a number of experiments in extrasensory perception. Illustrated above are samples of one of his experiments in telepathy. A pack of 25 cards is used. They are in sets of 5, each set containing 5 different symbols like those shown here. The symbols are mainly geometric and simple in design. One or more persons endeavors to transmit one of the symbols to a subject who, of course, has not seen the card selected. The subject may remain in the same room or be at a distant point. 5 right guesses in 25 is considered in excess of mere chance. Here we have symbolized another example of psychic phenomena. The 4 circles on the left, indicated by the letter B, represent a group of persons who are to agree on some particular thought which is to be transmitted to A the subject. However, sometimes the subject receives impressions from the minds of those present, that is, thoughts which were not even intended to be sent by them. This is another theory advanced in the phenomena of extrasensory perception. The circle on the left represents A, the agent, who is to transmit the thought. The straight horizontal line, designated A1, depicts his objective level of consciousness. A2, the wavy lines above, allude to the agent's other levels of consciousness, those which are above or beyond his conscious mind. The circle B represents the subject. This subject may at times receive ideas from these other levels of consciousness of the mind of the agent instead of the one intended. There are innumerable theories endeavoring to explain just how psychic phenomena, extrasensory perception, occurs. We have illustrated here symbolically some of these theories. It is said that emotional states are important to the success, for example, of telepathy. A here depicts the emotion of love, which may bring two minds into attunement. B depicts death. There are many examples of thoughts received from those at a distance who are on the threshold of death. In such instances, emotion apparently provided a strong stimulus to the psychic consciousness. C here represents the spine and the central nervous system. An English neurologist has advanced a theory that when one is dying, there is a sudden release of the activity of the primitive strata of the central nervous system in the form of an energy. This illustration depicts a prehistoric man of the Paleolithic era tens of thousands of years ago. Is psychic phenomena a vestigial function of the activity of the human mind? In other words, is it a reactivating of the primitive consciousness of man? Would it be the consciousness man depended on for centuries before he developed his faculty of reason? Does this consciousness surge to the fore at times in modern man as extrasensory perception? These are the mysteries and challenges in the exploration of the mind and self.